Welcome to the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast, presented by the Beef Cattle Research Council. The most popular content from beefresearch.ca, available on the go. Before we get into this week's episode, a quick message from the BCRC.
Boost your farm's profitability with BCRC's Gross Margins Calculator. This interactive tool helps beef cattle producers evaluate the financial performance of each enterprise and allocate limited resources like land more effectively. See quickly which combination of enterprises maximizes your profit. A link to the calculator can be found in the show notes. This episode is titled Home on the Range and features the BCRC's Science Director, Dr. Reynold Bergen.
Hi there, I'm Reynold. This Research on the Record article originally appeared in the April 2026 issue of Canadian Cattleman magazine, and we've reposted it on the beefresearch.ca site with the publisher's permission. Today we're singing Home on the Range. Cattle producers get frustrated when they work to improve their forage yields and forage quality, and then the local deer population moves in and eats it before their cattle can. But those wildlife might just be moving in as refugees, because the natural areas that they normally live in are getting cultivated or built up. So here comes a bit of a hard left. Think about what happens when a river floods. Water follows the path of least resistance, so it follows the riverbed at first. And the high ground remains exposed and dry. But it's flooding, so bystanders gather on the riverbank to watch the driftwood float by. And the water rises, and eventually it spills out over the riverbank and onto the surrounding floodplain. And cautious people start to leave the area. But the curious people just sort of climb to a higher vantage point. And the floodwaters continue to rise, and they begin to creep up the valley walls. And more spectators leave, but the really determined ones climb up to the very top of the river valley. And there's high ridges along the top of the valley, and those remain exposed and connected together, all on a big long line. But eventually, the rising water surrounds those high points too, and it floods the lower spots that connect them, and it isolates the different peaks from each other. And eventually, if the flood gets bad enough, all you're left with are small islands overcrowded with sightseers who are starting to question their life choices, and they're checking their cell reception, and they're scanning the horizon for helicopters. Now, a similar thing is kind of happening with rangeland biodiversity. So we've got a growing global population, and they need food. And biofuel incentives are supporting crop prices. And so if there's enough sunshine and moisture, high prices make it tempting to cultivate marginal grasslands to grow cash crops. And if you've got favorable crop insurance, it may make those cash crops look like a safe risk. So as more and more grassland gets cultivated, wildlife habitat starts to shrink, just like our flood scenario. And if too much forage and pastureland gets converted to crops, the remaining islands of grass get to be too small and disconnected from each other to support a functioning grassland ecosystem. Now, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Tim McAllister and a bunch of teammates from Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute and a bunch of universities in Egypt and Alberta and Toronto and Manitoba used Alberta as a case study to evaluate how continued conversion of hay and pastureland into crop production would impact biodiversity. And they've published that, and the publication's linked in the online version of this article if you want to read that for yourself. So how did they do this? Well, they examined Alberta's 6 natural regions. So the grasslands region in the south, the forested boreal region way up in the north, the parkland in between them, the foothills and Rocky Mountains on the west, and the Canadian Shield in the northeast. Now, most pasture and cattle production in Alberta occurs in the grasslands, the parkland, and the foothills. Then what they did was they overlaid on top of that the Canadian Land Suitability Rating System. And what that does is it rates land based on its potential to raise small grains and oilseeds. So Class 1, 2, and 3 land is the most productive. Class 6 and 7 land simply isn't suitable for farming, and Class 4 and 5 land is in between. So this research team modeled how Alberta's biodiversity might be affected if the tame and native pasture land that still remains on class 2, 3, 4, and 5 land ended up becoming cultivated for crop production. And here's what they learned. Well, a lot of tame pasture and grassland and wildlife habitat has already been lost, but it could still get worse. So in the grassland region, about 85% of the original connectivity still remains compared to before cultivated agriculture started in Alberta. Now, if cultivation continued and swallowed up all the remaining class 2, 3, 4, and 5 land, 66% of the remaining grassland would be lost, and the rest of it would be the higher end or the class 6 and 7 stuff. And about 50% of the original connectivity for biodiversity would remain. So that would have serious negative impacts for grassland biodiversity. Some of the remaining wildlife corridor would allow wildlife to move to neighboring regions. So, you'd still have some grassland corridors that would allow some biodiversity to move to Cypress Hills, say, or the foothills or the parkland regions. But it'd be kind of a long walk if you were a burrowing owl. So it would be a challenge. Now in the parkland region, there's higher rainfall and that grows trees. And so there's different types of biodiversity. And due to the higher productivity and there's more clearing and farming, about 55% of the original connectivity still remains in the parkland region. But if that cultivation expanded to include all of the remaining class 2, 3, 4, and 5 land in the parkland, about 87% of the remaining grassland would be lost, and only about 40% of the original connectivity among wildlife habitats would still remain. Well, some of those corridors would still be intact enough to allow wildlife to move north into the boreal region or south into the grassland region if those habitats allowed them to survive. Now in the foothills, there's still substantial connectivity, and part of that's probably because it's already absorbed a bunch of the biodiversity that's been squeezed out of the grasslands. So, for example, like grizzlies and elk and wolves used to be pretty common in the grasslands back in the day, but now they're mostly found in the foothills or the Rocky Mountains. Nearly 80% of the grassland remaining in the foothills region would be lost if the remaining class 2, 3, 4, and 5 land was cultivated, and then that would squeeze the connectivity of the wildlife habitat still farther. And some of the corridors to the Rocky Mountains or grasslands would still remain intact. So what does all this mean to you? Well, this research focused on Alberta, but regardless of where you raise cattle in Canada, cultivation, along with urban sprawl and industrial development and highways and reservoirs and solar farms and other hallmarks of progress that this study didn't consider, all of those things threaten grasslands and habitat connectivity and biodiversity. When you keep land and grass in cattle production, it's a nature-based solution to slow biodiversity loss and help to keep ecosystems intact. Bottom line is that a pasture can be cultivated in an hour, but it takes years to reestablish one. Canada's beef producers play a vital role in preserving Canada's natural spaces, providing key wildlife habitat, and the travel corridors that connect healthy populations and ecosystems. Happy Earth Day. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. You can find all relevant links and information at beefresearch.ca or in the show notes. The Beef Cattle Research Council is funded by the Canadian Beef Cattle Checkoff and strives for excellence in the production of Canadian beef, cattle, and forage through research, innovation, and extension. Tune in every Tuesday as the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast delivers straightforward insights, expert information, and a wealth of practical knowledge for Canadian beef producers. Subscribe now.